You like those? You have to pay her.
I have to pay?
The food up there is free. This is from the cafe.
Okay.
You can grab anything up there.
I'm the stewardship coordinator with Prairie Conservation Action Plan, and tonight I'm actually wearing two hats as well. I'm the chair of this lovely facility, Prairie and Silver Sage. PCAP and Prairie and Silver Sage are close partners. We work together to host presentations like this. So tonight, Dr. Geoff Holroyd will be talking about burrowing owls in Prairie, Canada. He did this presentation a number of years ago, but this will be an update. So for those of you who weren't here 3 years ago, it'll all be brand new. Just a note that PCAP actually does a monthly Native Prairie speaker series, so we have events going on all the time. We actually have another one in Valmarie, and that is July 18th. And that'll be at the Valmarie Show Hall, and Shirley Bartz will be talking about loggerhead shrikes, the stewards of Saskatchewan and butcher birds. So it should be a really neat one, and that's at 7 p.m. We also have a webinar that you can watch from any location coming up on July 9th, and it's about greater sage grouse. And Joel Nicholson, a senior wildlife biologist with Alberta Environment and Parks, Fish and Wildlife Management, will be talking about Alberta's greater sage grouse recovery strategy. And again, that'll be a webinar. I would just like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's presentation is provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and in-kind support has been given by Prairie Wind and Silver Sage, as well as Dr. Geoff Holroyd and Helen. So just a reminder to keep your questions to the end of the presentation, and we'll have time then for questions and more alcohol at the bar and really awesome food. It's always great when PCAP has an event at Prairie Winds because there's like white chocolate covered cherries and smoked salmon. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, so a little bit about Geoff. Dr. Geoff Holroyd's interest in birds developed as a teenager when he was an active volunteer and chairman of the Long Point Bird Observatory. He earned his BA in biology at the University of Western Ontario and his MSc and PhD from the University of Toronto for his studies of the foraging strategies and diet of swallows. In 1975, he moved to Banff and supervised ecological wildlife inventories of Banff, Jasper, Kootenay, Glacier, and Mount Revelstoke National Parks. In 1983, he moved to Edmonton as the head of the Threatened Wildlife section of the Canadian Wildlife Service. And after 4 years as manager, he returned to biology as a research scientist with Environment Canada, studying endangered species. He chaired the Burrowing Owl recovery team for 8 years and the Peregrine Falcon recovery team from its start in 1987 to its end in 2012. And he retired in 2012 after 36 years with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and is now the chair of Beaver Hill Bird Observatory. So with that, I'll introduce you. I'll turn it over to Geoff.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Yay!
With the promise of cherries over there, I think I might hold off and start to talk in a few minutes. So I thank you all for coming out. I know we get a precious few nice sunny evenings on the prairies, warm evenings like this, so I appreciate you coming indoors. I'd also like to acknowledge Tony and Dorothy behind me that actually heard about the talk. They live in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and just made it in time to attend the talk. I gather they were passing by. And then there's also a group here from the Nature Conservancy, and mention was made of me starting as a teenager at the Long Point Bird Observatory, and Michael Bradstreet was one of my teenage friends at that time, and we're still buddies. And also I want to acknowledge my co-author, co-worker, Helen Trefry, who almost had to do this talk and was magic, but convinced me that giving the talk is more important than other things. So the question is, where did all the burrowing owls go and why? So we've been working on this for 30 years. We've got a pretty good idea. And in the next hour, hopefully not too much more, but maybe a bit more, we're going to explain what we believe is happening. It's not every story has got to have an ending. This one doesn't have a happy ending. Maybe a little bit of hope, but not a happy ending. So you may already know, burrowing owls are endangered in Canada. Their numbers have declined precipitously. I'll show you some graphs. But they declined in the 1990s, a huge amount. We've never recovered from it, and their decline continues. So here's one example. Some of you are members of Nature Saskatchewan. I don't know if there's any Are there any Operation Burrowing Owl members in the audience? No landowners. So Nature Saskatchewan's coordinated the Operation Burrowing Owl program where landowners register with Nature Saskatchewan and then record owls on their property. So here's the number of owls. Started in 1987 as part of World Wildlife Fund's Wild West program. There was an increase in the first year as people subscribed. There were a lot more members by 88 than there were in 87. The numbers peaked for 2 years at 1,100 pairs of owls recorded by their members. And you can see what happened in the 90s. You can see what happened since. And in 2018, there were 18 pairs recorded in Saskatchewan by landowners. That doesn't mean there's only 18 pairs, but there's about 400, 450 members of Operation Burrowing Owl, and we can only come up with 18 pairs. So not a good story. Scientists in the audience might say, well, that's just landowners reporting, and there's biases inherent. So here's the study area in the Regina Plain. 4 different graduate student studies. Paul James started at around the same time, 87, and plotted a decline. He actually had 78 pairs in 87, so we just have to flip the letters. You can see that same decline in his study area in the Regina Plain. Troy Wellicombe came along, expanded his study area so he could find enough owls to continue his study. You can see a couple of good years, but decline. Ray Poulin, Danielle Todd, in Regina now, plotted the same decline. And by 2011, it just wasn't worth driving around trying to find enough owls in the Regina Plain. But basically, there's probably the odd pair there, but nobody surveyed them since then that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's a few records. So researchers found the same thing. And Helen and I have found similar things in 1-4 in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. So we started doing surveys in '98 in Grassland Park here. We're not sure we were as good at it as we are now, so we think this low number here might be slightly biased because it was a year of learning. And we had an interesting peak that came up in 2005, but the numbers have declined since then. This graph only goes to 2015, and Michelle from the park here somewhere is going to update us near the end of the talk on what's happened since then. And the 2005 is interesting because see the peak here. So they did have one good year, one population, maybe I get some drink please. They had one good year in 2005 in both places, Regina Plain and Grasslands Park, but haven't done well obviously since. So you're probably, how many people have seen a burrowing owl in the wild? Good. How many people have seen a burrowing owl in the wild in the last 5 years? The last 2 years? This year. Well, my point is, the number of hens starts to decline as you plunge into more recent years.
It's in a wine glass, but it's just water.
So the burrowing owl, a lot of you have seen, a few of you haven't, is the size of a pop can on stilts. So can of Coke or Pepsi, whatever your preference. And they have extra long legs. They weigh about 150 grams, so bigger than a solid owl. And they nest in grasslands, probably no surprise there. Their preferred habitat are prairie dog colonies. So the little black dots here are prairie dog colony in the Frenchman Valley in Grassland Park, where you find the owls. There are some that on places like the Regina Plain, but they're usually in corners which are not cultivated, because cultivation obviously covers over any badger, coyote, fox burrows, as opposed to in the prairie dog colonies where there's lots of burrows. What do they eat? So here we tried, the owl doesn't look very happy being offered a mouse, but in fact a lot of their diet are mice, but they also eat a lot of insects, grasshoppers, beetles, crickets, etc. So there's some of their diet items. Some of these are post pictures, obviously. And we'll get more into their diet a little bit later on, but that's their primary food. They nest in holes in the ground. Even though they're called burrowing owls, they don't burrow, except in a few places in Florida and in the winter on the Texas Gulf Coast. But obviously, if you ever tried to dig a hole in our soil, it's pretty hard even with a shovel, so there's no way a bird with claws can do that. So they're dependent on other animals to have a hole and then not come back and want the hole back for the summer. there's a lot of literature that says they occupy ground squirrel holes, and technically they don't. They need a ground squirrel hole is like 2 inches diameter. It's enlarged because the coyote, foxes, badgers being in there, and enlarged that, and then the ground squirrels come back in. But their real preference is prairie dog colonies. And with prairie dogs, they have a love-hate relationship, with badgers, a love-hate relationship. They need the badger to open up the burrow to make it big enough for them, but they don't want it to come back for at least that next summer. And as you'll see, sometimes that doesn't work out for the owl. So here's a motion-activated camera, a pair of owls looking concerned. Their burrow is here. Badger pops up. He's been down munching on their young. The male's not impressed, takes his life in his hands and tries to deter the badger, but the nest was empty when we came back and after we looked at these pictures. So now we'll get into their life history, what's happening underground. They lay a lot of eggs. On average, they lay 9. They can lay 12 eggs if they have lots of food. Sometimes they lay less. And if they have lots of food when the eggs hatch, they'll have lots of young. As we'll see, that's a key part of the problem with these owls. So from 9 eggs now, they're often only producing 3 or 4 young instead of 7, 8, or 9. And so the average productivity in Grassland Park up to 2015 is just under 3 young per nesting attempt. So predation is also factored in there, as well as lack of production. In the study area in Alberta, Joe Schmutz ran a study for quite a while, 10 years or so, and his average was 3.5 young. So remember, they're laying 9 eggs, but they're only coming up with 1/3 of that. So one of my first graduate students, Troy Wellicombe, did an experiment for his PhD in the Regina Plains, supplemental feeding the owls. So twice a week he would go and give them 12 or so mice thrown down the burrow. And what he found was if he does that, in most years, there's an increase in productivity. So the supplemental, the fed ones are the hatched column, and the unfed ones are the yellow. So some years it didn't make a big difference. One year, 1997, that we'll mention more, there was no difference. But the other years, sometimes a huge dramatic difference. If the owls weren't fed, they produced 2.5 young. If they were fed, they're producing over 7 young. So clearly something's happening down in the burrow where those eggs are not hatching and fledging. So he was studying them in artificial nest boxes. So he was able to open up the box and see what's going on. And this is a little bit, I'll just use 1 year. So this is survival, 100% survival. And you can see there's a little bit of mortality. These are fed young, fed nests, but most of them are alive. But look at what happens to the unfed ones. In the first 3 weeks, they starve to death. So there just isn't enough food. So the scenario is the female hatches the eggs. The eggs are still, it's cold down underground at that point, and her job is to keep them warm and to feed the young when the male delivers food. The male's job is to deliver food. But he's only going to be able to deliver enough food for the young if there's a lot of food available. So he needs either a lot of mice, a lot of voles, a lot of grasshoppers, a lot of crickets, a lot of dung beetles. He needs some abundant insect, and it's not happening. So in the first 3 weeks, he cannot provide enough food. After that, it levels out, and if he's only got 2 or 3 or 4 young left, then they will survive. In 1997, look at that, there's no difference between the fed ones and the unfed ones. So the story in 97 is fairly unique. It probably happened more in the past. In October of 96, there was a snow on the prairies that stayed. So there's a deep snow. The ground actually didn't freeze. Talking to farming friends, they were able to put post holes in all winter. I used to be on CBC, and I put a thermometer on the ground in my backyard. It's minus 35 outside. The ground was 0. So the ground didn't freeze, and voles, particularly meadow voles, can breed under the snow. So there's the grass would have been cured in October. Lots of food. It's relatively warm down there. The meadow voles had a very productive winter. In the spring of 97, the landowners said there's meadow voles everywhere. and the owls were able to capitalize on that. So it didn't matter if they were fed or not, they produced 7.3 young out of their 9 eggs. The other interesting factor there is another problem for the owls is mortality. Hawks. On the Regina Plain in 1997, the raptor index that the graduate students were collecting went up tenfold compared to 96 and 98. So there are 10 times as many raptors. There was 0 mortality by raptors. They're totally cued into the meadow holes. So it was a double benefit. So Danielle Todd, who was looking at post-fledging survival, 100% of the young survived from emergence from the burrow till when they left in the fall. She had 0 mortality from raptors, whereas other years she had quite considerable mortality. So that was a pretty unique year, but that's the only year that's been recorded like that since. So when I got involved in around 97, I worked for the federal government. Burrowing owls weren't a high priority, but they just got listed under SARA, what was precursor to SARA. And the researchers said, we don't know where they go, somebody's got to go find them. So, somebody's got to hold out their hand and say, I'll go to Mexico in the winter and try and find them. It was a tough assignment, but I self-assigned it. It's a long story about my manager saying, no, you won't. And I said, yes, I will. So our first thing to do was ask Helen, raised owls or got owls from the Kamloops Zoo, and we use them for a lot of public education. So this, I think, is Nappy. So we asked Nappy where we'd like to go for the winter, but the answer was inconclusive. So then Helen decided to let Nappy steer, but then we almost got us rolled over, so that didn't work out well. So then we took a more technical approach and formed the banding office and got all the bird banding recovery records. So there's a few from Saskatchewan and Manitoba that come down to the Gulf Coast, but no further, and they were all in the fall. There were no winter records of Saskatchewan and Manitoba records, band recoveries in the winter, but there's one from Oklahoma down to Guadalajara. And one of the messages that I've told students since then is you've got one data point, don't ignore it. This is a good chance that's the mean rather than an outlier. And in fact, as you'll see, the mother lode of wintering burrowing owls occurs in the Central Valley of Mexico. It took us a long time to find it. So I first went down there. Graduate student Ricardo Rodriguez was studying burrowing owls at the junction of these 3 states here. This is the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve. He studied burrowing owls for 2 years for their master's degree. He said, I'll meet you there and we'll find them. There should be some there in the winter. Well, it wasn't true. And so the Mapimi area is a dry desert. In the winter, it's cold and dry. It's not, the insect activity is not very abundant. And we drove around and we walked the grassland areas where we found them in the summer, and they'd left there as well. So you don't just leave Canada, you even leave northern Mexico. But of course, when you're driving around in a rented combi van, you end up getting a flat tire. And so obviously we carried a spare, and then we got another flat tire, and there's a limit to how many flat tires you can carry. So after 3 flat tires, we got pretty frustrated, and I told them not to do it. We set it on fire. We then discovered we had very little water. I had the only half a liter of water, and so we started trekking back across the desert to the research station. It wasn't long before the vultures were circling, and the result was obvious. The reality was, this is what we looked like. We were totally parched, our feet were blistered. It was not a fun activity, not a fun day. And then we got a break. A photographer contacted us from the Texas Rio Grande area, and he photographed an owl. And so Helen and I were going down there looking for wintering owls. We'll get to the telemetry in a minute. We stopped at his office and he showed us the picture. And we said, wait a minute, you can read the band. So you probably can't there, but when you blow it up and you get enough pixels, you can read band wash 819. Well, Troy had banded a male burrowing owl in the Regina Plain with a red band, double red band on the right leg, and the suffix on the band was 81919. So this is almost certainly the owl that Troy had banded the previous year. This was right on the Rio Grande. So we finally had a Saskatchewan to Texas wintering record. we went back with the photographer, and there was a pile of feathers. So the owl had gotten eaten. We never did find the legs, but almost for sure that owl didn't make it. So at the same time we were doing this, I had graduate students, plus the ones I mentioned in the China Plain, studying burrowing owls, and we're looking at their habitat use and their foraging in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And we were putting transmitters on their back and then using classical VHF telemetry. So we decided to put slightly heavier batteries on so they lasted the winter, rented a Cessna in Rockport, Texas, and flew over Texas and northern Mexico. Actually by then Helen was working with me full-time. We flew 50 transects every 50 kilometers from Houston, Texas to Guadalajara, Mexico. So we think we should be in the Guinness World's Record for having the most hours listening to static while flying in a Cessna 8,000 feet off the ground. So the scenario is, the person in the back's got headphones on, 4-hour shift, that's the longest the tank will last, listening to static, waiting for a beep, 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 and after 4 hours you land, you refuel, you get lunch, and then we switch places. And, anyway, we did get some, that was the good news. But a lot of the country we flew looked like this, not very hospitable. There were lots of stories, so we left Puebla, Mexico, flew north on our transect, turned to come south, and when we turned back, this is the view we had. I didn't take this picture, but the local volcano, starts with Papa or something, had blown up, and we were literally the last plane to leave the airport before it blew up, but we didn't know it was in the rear view. So we dismissed that, and then we were coming back towards Puebla, and this isn't us. I don't have a picture of us. But we're flying along, and I said to the pilot, hey, there's a paved runway that's not on our map, because I'm tracking this on the map. He said, yeah, that's weird. So 10 minutes later, he's on the radio to Puebla in Spanish, and I knew enough to say, hey, the engine's overheating. So I look at the heat, and the island's redlined, and it's crashed against the barrier. So he turned back and said, we're going to go land at our paved runway. So we just did a straight-in landing. He reassured us if the engine seized, he could land there. So I mean, here I am thinking I'm going to die. We do a straight-in land, pull off on the apron to a big hangar. The doors open, and half of the Mexican army runs out with machine guns on the level. So drug runners have created this runway, and the Mexican army have got it staked out with drug runners. So we then had to convince them that we're not drug runners, and we pull out our government passports. The general in charge was very nice. They worked on the plane, and he wanted to practice his English, so he told us that he toured Canada with our general to Shasta, and we were supposed to be impressed, and I'm afraid I've never heard of general. I'm sure he's a good guy. So in the flying, though, we did find transmitters. So we found one owl wintering in this old field under these shrubs where there's furrows. So obviously not really ideal habitat, no hole in the ground, but presumably there's still insects wandering. But when we came back 6 months later, that's the same view. So the reason it was fallow is the developer bought it and was turned into a subdivision. So habitat loss is certainly an issue in the winter. Another owl that we found in Veracruz, we went back, and so the interesting part here, which we don't tell too many side stories, we're 8,000 feet, and I think I was in the back at this point. I've got an owl, and so I tell the pilot it's on the left. Right? I can toggle left antenna, right antenna. So then he starts spiraling down to the left, making sure that I don't lose it. Right? So he turns right, or turns left again when I'm starting to lose it. So you're spiraling down in a tighter and tighter circle. We flew right over this orange grove, you do a GPS, and then you come back a couple of months later in the vehicle. By then we picked up a Mexican student to work with us. And we drove in, and there's a landowner, and we explained what we're doing. And he said, were you guys in a plane and you spiraled down over top of me? It's like, yeah. He says, I wondered what you were doing. And so then we had to explain what we're doing, which is tracking owls from Canada. The bad news was this owl would be eaten. What we found was the transmitter and a pile of feathers and a pair of roadside hawks in the area. And we got a wintering location, but we didn't find a live owl. Another one that we found in northern Michoacan, not that far from where the monarch butterflies go, but in the lowlands, was in this thorn scrub cactus woodland. And there were 6 or 8 owls in there. We obviously it's very hard to see, but what the owl was doing is standing in the shadow of the cactus. The glimpses we got. We flushed several owls, but we finally saw the owl we wanted. So one reason we had to see the owl is we had so many owls we couldn't have that many frequencies. So we actually had to read the alphanumeric number on the band. So we actually had to see the bird to figure out exactly which one it was. So we ended up getting half a dozen. There's a couple of extras overlapping here in Texas, and then the 2 that I mentioned in Mexico. So this started to indicate that although South Texas might be interesting, we've never had a band recovery in the winter. We should start further south. Remember that I said I was in Mapimi, which is here, and all the owls have left the area here. So they have actually gone further south. So, I'm going to change this one. This is from one of my graduate students, Jason Duxbury, who loved making me press all the buttons. So then we did a stable isotope analysis. So it was one of these aha moments. Those of you that know Keith Hobson know that he pioneered some of the research on looking at the feather chemistry and determining where an owl grew its feather. And so you can track it back. So we collected feathers from the owls in the winter, and then plotted them, ran them through a mass spectrometer, and then we could plot them on a map. And it was a map that we created from nestlings. So we got all the researchers studying burrowing owls, which aren't that many, in the western US, created this map of isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and then plotted the wintering bird's feathers on there, looking for signatures that would correspond with the prairies. So we delineated the isotope. So those are all the different populations of nestlings that we sampled. And then we were able to take the feathers that we collected from traps that we set in our study areas in Mexico. We actually gave Jason a couple. This is the dead one in the orange grove. And one of these is the one that was in the, no, that one we didn't find that. We found a couple of others where we had bands. So I know one was the one from Texas that was Troy's. We gave them to Jason blind, and he plotted them back to the Regina Plain where we knew they'd come from. So that was our not quite double blind, but checker. So we found quite a few. We had a study area